listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with this episode of The Briefing. Imagine going into your local pharmacy and not being able to fill out your prescription because they ran out of stock. Well, that's been the reality of a lot of patients across the country, with medical shortages being a hot topic over the last year, impacting patients, doctors and pharmacists alike. And at the time of recording, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or the TGA, has 412 current shortages listed for Australia on its website, with 75 anticipated shortages and 266 discontinuations. But is it really as bad as it seems, and who is to blame? The Australian Medical Association published a forum at the end of January this year with suggestions for the TGA to improve the shortages. And the president of AMA, Dr. Danielle McMullin, joins me now. Dr. Danielle, are we at risk of never-ending medicine shortages in Australia?
Look, I think it'll be no surprise to listeners that medicines shortages are a challenge in Australia. We've always had them, like any other product, same as, the toilet paper on the shelves at times, but certainly other products, things go in and out of stock. And sometimes we see supply shortages for a variety of reasons we can get into. But obviously with medicines, that can be really critical to people who need their medicines to treat chronic conditions. And we have been in the situation since really COVID where we have had more frequent and longer lasting shortages. And while our TGA, which is the regulator who manages some of these shortages, generally does a really great job of trying to manage them, there are some areas that we think could be improved.
Yeah, because it does feel like it has gotten worse in the past year or so, especially. Has it really gotten worse?
It's sometimes hard to say. It's probably a combination of there are more and longer lasting shortages, but probably more high profile medicines, so to speak, things that people are talking about more. So the media has latched onto it a bit more often and people have been more broadly affected. Now, the things we're talking about here over the past few years, we've seen significant shortages in some hormone replacement therapy products, some mental health medications, so some antidepressants and some treatments for ADHD, and some diabetes medicines obviously really made the news. So it's those sorts of shortages that really have an impact on patients that I see and people across Australia, and I think that's why we've been talking about it more.
So how do these shortages happen? You mentioned a few of the medications there. How does a medicine shortage happen?
Often the reasons behind medicines shortages are multiple. So like anything that needs to be manufactured, sometimes there's a manufacturing error. So there might be an issue in a plant that means a batch or a few batches of medicine aren't able to be released onto the market. And obviously quality and safety is really important. There are other factors in terms of shipping. I mean, we're still seeing global kind of logistics challenges in terms of getting products shipped around the world. And sometimes, and for a lot of these products more recently, it's been a really big spike in demand. And so we've had some of those diabetes medicines in particular. People will be familiar with the brand name Ozempic. Obviously, demand for that particular medicine just went through the roof and supply couldn't keep up with that demand. And often it's a confluence of all of those factors that mean it's hard to get a medication on the shelf at your pharmacy.
So does this shortage mean that there are Australians that are potentially going without life-saving medications, or is it just certain brand names? You know how we might go to the pharmacy and they say, oh, we don't have the brand name, you can just get the generic. What is going on there?
That's a really great question, and most of the time it's just a particular brand that's in shortage. So people may have heard about the TGA shortages database, which is a tool the TGA has to help inform us about shortages, and there's just over 400 medicines on that at the moment, which sounds like a huge number, but for most of those there's a relatively easy swap, a different brand or a different formulation. But for about 30 to 40 of those medicines at the moment, there isn't an easy alternative. And they're the ones we do worry about. Obviously, for patients at the easy end of the spectrum, it's frustrating. You've got to run around from pharmacy to pharmacy or maybe call back your doctor to get a slightly different script. And that's a lot of time and energy wasted. But at the more significant end, there are patients who can't get the medicine they need and are running towards when their next dose is due or end up missing some doses. And obviously that's not a scenario we want to be in.
So right now, why isn't there a safeguard that exists so medicines that are essential can't have a shortage. Is there a way that we can have a surplus of medicines, or is that kind of in the work? I know the AMA has a proposal in the forum that is suggested to the TGA. Can you run us through why a safeguard isn't in place yet?
In fact, we do have a number of safeguards already in place. So some good things that the TGA has been doing is making sure that for a certain number of critical medicines that we have 6 months supply onshore. So that has been an improvement over the past few years. And medicines companies, if they're planning to withdraw a product from the market, that they've got to give 12 months notice for that. So there's quite a lot of safeguards in place. But what we're finding is that some of our other unexpected shortages, that we tend to be a little bit reactive to that and kind of waiting for that shortage to really be critical before the public necessarily knows about it, or more importantly, sometimes before prescribers, doctors know about that shortage. We think there could be more communication with doctors and with pharmacists to look at shortages on the horizon. Sometimes we get a few little signals that there might be a shortage coming, and we think there could be a forum to better explore those and to make sure that doctors and pharmacists understand what shortages are in place or could be coming on the horizon and what we should do in response to that. There's things we can do like continuing existing patients but not prescribing that particular medicine to new people for a little while, or encouraging patients to make sure that they have a week or so's supply ahead before going and asking, when they ask for their next script. There's a few little strategies that we as doctors could put in place, but we don't know unless we know the shortage is coming. So we're just asking for a more proactive forum and a bit more education across the sector to make sure we're doing everything we can to make it easier for patients when you need your meds.
Yeah, because how is this changing the way that doctors are prescribing medications? If they did have more communication in place, would they then be able to prescribe their patients maybe a different brand name or a different medication that could do the same job?
Exactly. So we've seen that recently with hormone replacement therapy, HRT, for menopause. So there's been some shortages for quite a while now in some of the menopause hormone treatments. And there was recently some advice from the TGA that for the particular treatment of estrogen patches, that we should consider not starting new patients on that therapy for now because there's such a shortage. Now, that advice is useful. Yes, it's frustrating for women who might be seeking that therapy, but we do have alternatives like gels and tablets that we can try new patients on initially, and it at least gives us the awareness that, look, this really is in shortage. Let's try and continue people on that treatment who are already taking it. But for new patients, let's look at alternatives first while we manage this shortage until it gets better.
When we're talking about where our medication comes from, what proportion of medication is made locally in Australia, or does a lot of it come from overseas?
Most of our medicines in Australia come from overseas. There is some local manufacture, and it's always important that we talk about, could we make more onshore? And for some medicines, perhaps we could. But we're a pretty small country relative to the rest of the world, and it's probably impractical to say that we can make every single medicine that we need all onshore here. We're never going to be able to achieve that. So we're likely to continue to be in that scenario where the majority of our medicines are imported. And so it's really important that we have those international supply chains set up, ready to go, and that we've got good lines of communication with the manufacturers.
You touched on some of the reasons earlier, but who is to blame for medicines being in short supply?
I think this really isn't a blame game. There's lots of factors that lead to medicines shortages, and even onshore here in Australia, the TGA and the government more broadly really do try to make sure that supply chains are open, that information is shared. But as is the case with a whole lot of other shortages, there's sometimes factors outside their control. And so what we think could be improved is the proactive thinking about that, and then some of the information that gets down to doctors, pharmacists, and patients about existing shortages and how long they might last for, what we should do about them, and then also any shortages we think might be on the horizon.
These shortages could potentially have really damaging or negative impacts on patients. Have we seen anyone being seriously harmed because of these medical shortages? And if that is so, then who is responsible?
So luckily, to my knowledge, there haven't been significant life-threatening events related to shortages. but that doesn't mean it's not a serious problem. Obviously, even the inconvenience of having to go around to different pharmacies is a real problem, and certainly having to switch and change brands can have time and money and other consequences for patients. So this is a problem, but the sector and doctors and pharmacists really are working closely together for individual patients to try and find alternatives. And if a particular medicine is going to be out of stock for a while, really working with that patient to work out what we can do instead. It's not a great solution long term, but everyone really is working together. And I would want to reassure listeners and patients that even if their medicine is in shortage, that it's really important to talk to your pharmacist and talk to your doctor about what you should do about that.
So if the TGA takes on some of your suggestions about, to me, it sounds like planning ahead and more communication when it comes to patients and doctors and pharmacists, if the TGA takes on your suggestions, could we see less shortages over the next year or so?
If the TGA takes on our suggestions about better planning ahead and more communication in the health sector, I think we'll see less impact of shortages. Now, obviously, you can't always prevent a shortage from happening, but what we can do better is plan for that and respond to that so that we don't see as much impact on patients and that the system helps sort that out for them. So that's our goal, is to reduce that impact on patients trying to get their medicines.
If someone is listening to this and they might have experienced a shortage of their own medicine before, or they're worried about, oh gosh, could this happen to me? What could somebody do? Should they talk to their GP if they're worried? Should they talk to their pharmacist? What should someone do if they're worried?
Definitely, if you try and get your prescription filled and you're told your medicine is in shortage, the first thing to do is ask the pharmacist whether it's just out of stock at their pharmacy, because actually pharmacies can often order things in really quickly and get it the next day. Or if it's a broader shortage, have a conversation with the pharmacist and with your GP about alternatives and how to find a different way to stay on your same medicine, or in a worst case scenario, having that conversation with your GP about whether short term you might need to change your medicines. Certainly the advice is not to change your medicines without discussing that with your GP first. Always the advice is have a chat to your doctor if there's any problems.
Dr. Danielle, thanks so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thanks very much for having me. Anytime.
That was the president of AMA there, Dr. Danielle. And if you've been impacted by medicine shortages, we'd love to hear your thoughts. You can send us a DM on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. But that's it for this episode of The Briefing. If you love this episode, if you can share it with someone else you think might enjoy it, that really does help us keep doing interviews just like this one. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on TikTok and YouTube. Just search for Listener Newsroom. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. I'm Helen Smith. See you next time.